on as the first guest. My plan is to do 100 episodes with men from different fields of life. And
Fantastic.
You being my blood brother, amongst many other things, and someone who's got a deep appreciation of human psychology and of the human condition, I thought there's no better way than to have you as a first guest on the Masculine Mastery podcast. And you had the honor of reading the book as well. How did you find it?
Well, firstly, it's an honor and a privilege to be the first guest. No, just in terms of the book itself, I think it's something that's deeply needed, especially from someone with your background. You started from nothing. You made it into medicine, and then you branched out into all these different fields. So I think from your perspective, you can bring something different to the manosphere. There are so many YouTubers and Twitter accounts nowadays, they're spouting very abstract ideas, which, they're great for a quick quote, but I don't think, the average Joe, working a 9 to 5, you can apply those to his life. So I think the book itself, it summarizes the key tenets of masculinity very well.
Thank you. Great. That's good feedback. It's still a work in progress in terms of refining the next chapter. But I thought concurrently we could run the podcast series as well as get the book out as well. And really, I didn't want to take too much time on a Friday evening. Besides the usual catch-up, I just wanted to, like I'm going to ask all my guests going forward, what does modern masculinity mean to you?
I think it's a tough question to answer, really, because trying to quantify it is very difficult. For me personally, masculinity, modern masculinity is a mindset of how to tackle life's problems. I think a significant part of that is the idea of stoicism and reacting to life pragmatically rather than through emotion. I think any individual who possesses those traits, has reached a very high level of masculinity. Reacting to things logically, putting plans in place to mitigate any adverse events in the future. I think that mindset of doing things when you don't want to do them, it's an all-encompassing thing, so it's very difficult to just pinpoint one thing. But for me, a good part of my 20s was spent trying to develop this stoic mindset of how to deal with the ups and downs of life. And I think for me, that was my transition into this whole manosphere space, and the whole definition of masculinity stems from there, really.
Right, that's a nice, relatively concise answer of imprecise kind of science. And I think the main thing you said there, which I picked up anyway, is pragmatism, the ability to be pragmatic, an ability to not necessarily be unperturbed, but ability to be impervious and impenetrable. You will get shaken, of course, but you don't let that trauma of life, you don't let life's vicissitudes and ups and downs penetrate your deep core, and your core remains, firm. Your resolve and resolution remains firm and consistent. You might get sidetracked somewhat, but you never fall down. You might, sway on your journey, but you never let emotions dictate your next step. And I think what you said there, it's quite fitting. So in terms of Stoics, obviously we know the Stoics were the Greek and Romans, Spartans, and the Greek philosophers as well, the Zeno, the Plato, Socrates, Marcus Aurelius of Rome, and Seneca, etc. What does Stoicism look like now in 21st century Western world?
That's a good question, but I think for us, simply because of the environment we were raised in, which was significantly emotional in terms of the way people reacted to things. There was constant shouting and screaming, and the way people resolved conflict was through physicality. So I think for us, the journey into Stoicism and trying to adopt that into our life was slightly different, because we used it as a tool really to to do well in our lives going forward. I think in the modern day world, Stoicism is really look, life has always been unjust. The universe is indifferent, and especially for men as well, in particular, high testosterone, highly ambitious men, who want to branch out and conquer the world, really, I suppose, metaphorically. For us, Stoicism is looking at the injustices of the world and reacting accordingly. So saying, okay, look, there are, for example, let's talk about the family system. So the family court system, for example, that is, we all know from data, that's heavily skewed against men. So developing a Stoic philosophy based on that would be saying, okay, look, these are the things in my life I can control, and these are the things in my life I can't control. So I'll act accordingly to those parameters which have been put in place. So yeah, I mean, it's very difficult to pinpoint precisely, because obviously, our emotions change on a daily basis and hourly basis. So for me, that's essentially what it's been about.
Right, yeah, that makes sense. And we've seen now anyway with recent events in America with Johnny Depp and Amber Heard regarding the court system, which without taking sides, it's just fairly obvious that custody and kind of financial costs do heavily favor the woman in terms of maintenance and custodianship of the children. The other question I wanted to ask you is, we've seen kind of first wave feminism, second and third wave feminism, we've got neo-feminism and radical feminism, we've got all these branches of feminism. Now that can be blamed for the apparent misery and loneliness of many women, but how does that explain, if at all, the ineptitude and the apathy and lack of motivation, discipline and laziness of many of today's men?
I think society, as a whole, we often we don't realize the struggle of a man. The majority of men throughout history, the majority of men today, they live miserable, lonely lives. And I think, so the third world feminists, they constantly talk about the patriarchy. So essentially what they're doing is they're looking at the very tail end of the male population. So the 1 or 2% of men in highly powered positions, and then they make general assumptions on the entire population based on those. Now, I think the general sort of laziness of men, it's almost like men have seen the game as rigged.
Okay.
So I think finally men have seen the game of life and said, okay, look, all these things are against me. There are systems in place, political systems, there are social systems in place whereby the world is unjust. And they've decided, okay, the only way to win is to not play. That's a quote from the movie War Games, 1984. So the only winning move is to not play. So a lot of men have literally just pushed the king over on the chessboard, put their hands up and walked away from life. They live this very this reclusive life almost, where they're detached from everything, from community, from family, from any sort of male brotherhood, from any sort of networking. So, the large aspect is, we've got to blame society, but also then again, there are there's a lot we can learn from great men of history. Look, life is unfair, the universe is unjust. Okay, that's cool. play your cards and move forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that explains certainly, to some extent, men's general apathy with the status quo. So men are, in essence, rebelling over the last 30, 40 years against the social constructs which they deem against them. So does that make the majority of men non-players in this game, and therefore it's actually easier for men to race ahead in the race of life because most men are not playing?
That's a good point. But I think from an evolutionary perspective, it's always been the top 10, 20% of men who have conquered and succeeded in life. Mm-hmm. So, it's not a normal distribution in terms of, male mating and male success. It's always been the top percentile of men who are the highest testosterone, who have had this sort of innate desire to conquer and do well. I think now those differences have been amplified. So that top percentile has gotten smaller and smaller. So for men who are who want to achieve something in life, I think they can race ahead. I think they can, because there are simply less players. Like a lot of men have, so the whole MGTOW movement, for example, men going their own way. So that, for example, that's taken a huge section of men out of the dating pool. So for highly ambitious men, I think it is easier to get ahead. But it's look, in terms of the cards you were dealt in life, that's not fair. But don't just fold. You've got to play them and see where you end up. So
I think that's a good point. The analogy of the cards. Whatever cards you get dealt, whichever hand you get dealt in life, whether it's a good hand or a bad hand, you still got to bring your cards to the table, and you have to play them right. And there's a very good interview I listened to recently with Rep 32. He was interviewed by Stephen Bartlett on the Diary of a CEO. And he's come from Tottenham, single parent family, comes from council estate. And he says, look, ostensibly the cards were stacked against me. But he says, I never used that in a defensive way. I actually used it as a fuel for my fire. I didn't use that with a chip on my shoulder. I actually used my social disadvantage to my advantage. And I think that's something we can relate to anyway. Growing up, we kind of, life is inherently unfair. And like you say, the universe is by its very nature indifferent to your suffering. The celestial bodies still spin, the earth still rotates, the moon still orbits, regardless of the pain, regardless of famine, regardless of war and tsunamis and COVID-19. The earth doesn't, decelerate because of COVID-19. The earth still spins on its axis. And that again goes back to this Seneca's book on the shortness of life, where he says, look, the celestial bodies are indifferent to your pain, and as a man, you have to just plow through. And the idea of 10% of men who get this, and they're the ones that race ahead. The 90% that don't do that, they then, mourn and kind of, vexatiously complain against life's unfairness. But the 10% of men that do get it, who've read the philosophy, who've read the nature of life and deep human psychology, will know that it's never been fair. You just gotta pick yourself up, bring stack your chips right, and play. Deal all aces with whichever hand you got dealt with.
No, absolutely. Just going back to the point you mentioned about social demographics, I think that's an element or a predictor in human success, which is looked over constantly. People constantly talk about race and gender and ethnicity as prime indicators of success. I've always said
class.
The class you were born into, that is the biggest indicator
Absolutely.
of where you will go in life. Because the percentage of people who sort of want to move out of the situation, which is very difficult from both sides. So the bottom side, the the working class individuals, they have this crabs in a bucket mentality, whereby, you know, once they see someone slowly climbing out, they'll call you a sellout, or, you know, or the classic phrase, "you've changed," which I'm sure you've heard a few times. Yes, of course I've changed. You know, I want to better myself and escape this this prison that I'm in. And then also from the top side as well, so those in the middle class, you know, they're almost like they're bitter towards people who have gone through social mobility. So, for example, when we went to uni for the first time, you know, we obviously had to, you know, fix a few impediments that we had from the council estate, you know, the way we spoke and certain mannerisms and using slang and in it and all this. So, yeah, I think there's backlash from both ends. And then once you add the complexity of culture on top of that as well, you get this concoction of trash and mess, and yeah, it's difficult to escape that mental prison. So I'm glad we're both here today having this conversation, hopefully motivating people to do the same thing.
No, great. It's some great points there, and I think the point about social mobility is a pertinent one, because I've always said I have much more in common with a white working class lad from Salford, from Glasgow, from Newcastle than I do for any, you know, ostensibly Pakistani Asian looking guy from down south, or who went to grammar school or, you know, private school, because culturally we are different.
Absolutely. Do you know the phrase "misery loves company"? Poverty loves company as well. Poverty does not care. It does not care.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And, you know, if you look back at our grandfather when he came to the UK, you know, some of his best friends were just made down in the, you know, the kind of literally on the coalface in the steel factories. And that did not care about your name or your skin color, but you were all the same working class guys trying to make a better living, working 16 hours a day for your family,
and 6 days a week. That was it.
That was the kind of, almost you could say, the fraternity, the brotherhood that formed in the kind of you know, the fortresses of the front line, you know, literally the dungeons and the kind of you know, cracks and crevices of the coal mines and steel factories of the 60s and 70s. The other question I want to ask you is, you know, there's no doubt that a lot of men are going through not only mental health issues, it's something which I talk about a lot, but also, you know, part of that is a existential kind of angst and crisis, also a crisis of masculinity, because now you're getting this whole incel movement, which are then resorting to honor-based killings and, you know, extremism and mass shootings. You got all these Reddits and subreddits about that. You got the extreme toxic masculinity. You got fragile masculinity, and you know, it's when anything gets suppressed or oppressed, you see fringe movements, or when anyone feels like they've been misunderstood, you get fringe movements. And I think tables have turned. You know, women were misunderstood for many centuries. In fact, if you look at Europe, you know, women weren't even allowed basic rights, which was the right to vote or own land or even go to university, which is a far cry from what happened in the Eastern, in the Orient, and in the Muslim worlds. But nevertheless, now the tables seem to have turned, and it's men who feel more oppressed. It's men who feel like they're on the back foot, and it's men who feel like they've not got a fair crack at life, and that's leading to some very fringe movements, and which are quite, you know, quite damaging, quite, you know, because, you know, yes, masculinity is you know, chivalry and all these kind of virtuous attributes should be encouraged, but then we don't want to go into the path of extreme toxic masculinity, because then you'll be inside of each other. You've got toxic masculinity on one side, you've got radical feminism on the other side, and they both out of each other. And I think, you know, there is a real crisis of masculinity. Men don't know which path to tread on. And do you have any kind of concluding words for men who just don't find their masculinity or find their inner voice?
I think it all links back to the idea of not being able to accept the injustices of the world, or the injustices of the universe. Now, one thing that's quite interesting, if you ever go on these incel subreddits or on 4chan or one of these fringe extremist forums, one thing you'll notice is the rampant misogyny stems from incels have this narcissism. It's a weird paradox in their lives whereby they hate themselves because they don't feel manly enough, but also they think they're better than others. So now, for example, in the case of Elliot Rodgers,
British. He was born and raised in. I think he was born and raised in the UK, then went to America. Is that right?
Exactly. Yeah. So the school shooter. So like, if you ever watch his manifesto, he talks about being the supreme gentleman, and like how these women will be blessed to have him in his life. And he talks about, the women choose these brutes over me. So there's this weird paradox and mindset that they have whereby they diminish themselves because they don't feel masculine enough. Usually it stems from, being short or, being diminutive in physical size, or, not having certain social cues like wealth. But yeah, this narcissism, it's see, male anger that gets converted into physicality.
Yeah.
So that's how they would express their emotion. Whereas female anger tends to go down, the more gossip and non-physical acts. But yeah, so I think social media has highlighted these fringe groups a lot more, because now they have communities wherein they can talk, and this just amplifies their misogyny, because they're all in this circle jerk of sharing emotion and all this stuff. But once again, it stems from the inability to look at the injustices of life. Okay, fair enough, you were born 5'5". Okay, fair enough, like you weren't born to the wealthiest parents. Okay, put a plan in place to be the best version of yourself. I know it sounds corny, but I mean, it all stems from that inability. Like, you can't accept the world for what it is, like the world has to be a certain way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think having the idealized conception of the world, it does lead to a lot of angst and a lot of unfulfilled dreams and promises. And I think the only thing you can control is yourself. You can't control the world. You can't control social norms and laws and social conventions. Only control yourself, and becoming the best version of yourself in every single domain. That's literally the only thing you have in control. And I think a lot of men will like to externalize their anger and blame politics and feminism, and then directly and indirectly become misogynistic. Whereas if they directed that anger towards themselves and actually use that as fuel for self-improvement and to drive real meaningful transformation, then that the world will be a better place. There will be less school shootings, and there'll be less kind of these misogynistic forums. There'll be less toxic masculinity. There'll be less kind of violence from men against women. There'll be less of that pent-up anger, because that anger will be transmuted rather into positive energy, which can be a force for good going forwards.
Absolutely, no. That's exactly what it is. That's why the things you're doing, with the podcast and the book, I think it's exactly what a lot of these fringe men need. And I think especially in the UK as well, luckily we don't have the open access to guns like in America. But I think, we still see in those, that large demographic of men, who've ostracized themselves from society, and I think they're so afraid of self accountability and looking for that self improvement, because if you fail, then it's on you. You can't blame anything. You can't blame any system.
Yeah, right. And I think a big part of being a man, if you look at all the Stoics and the Spartans and the Greek philosophers, was not being afraid to fail. They say you fail forward. But now in society, that's why, especially in immigrant families, we encourage medicine, We encourage law and engineering, and we encourage these, safe professions because we hate failure. We hate the failure associated with startups and business and entrepreneurialism. So, I think that's been internalized by a lot of men. They risk nothing, and as a result, they risk everything.
Well, I think when you mentioned, some of the ethnic minority communities and the pressures that come along with that, I think failure is synonymous with shame.
Yeah.
And shame in these communities is worse than death.
Yes, absolutely. It's all about saving face. And
absolutely.
Honor, there's nothing that supersedes honor. Honor is paramount, and you must always save face. And this kind of honor-based system, we know as a doctor, I've seen the other side of this in terms of FGM and beatings, and I've seen this, 10 years as a doctor, I've seen a lot of this. But the other side is the psychological trauma, which is, like bottlenecked, which is really contained of, constant comparisons, constant belittling, constant kind of, digs and passive aggressive remarks. And that does have its toll on the psyche of a lot of men growing up. They do grow up very, not to say cowardly, but lack of confidence, lack of confidence rather. They grow up with a lack of kind of self-awareness, lack of, and most importantly, lack of self-belief. And without self-belief, you can't achieve anything in life. Self-belief literally is the main recipe for you to succeed and be socially mobile.
Absolutely, no. I think you're 100% correct in that, Asif. And one of the things is, I call it the colonial inferiority complex that a lot of ethnic minorities have. So they carry that with them, and then you add the cultural pressures from their families. It's a recipe for disaster. That's why you don't see many in top CEO positions. There's a reason, because they have this constant inferiority complex from both sides of their life.
Yeah.
And that lack of self-belief, they'll never venture outside their own little communities.
Yeah.
They won't be able to walk into a boardroom with 5 60-year-old white men, shake their hand, look them in the eye, and converse as peers. They constantly have this they're so afraid of failure that they don't even try. I think that's one of the biggest tragedies a man can ever go through. Like, if you're on your deathbed and you recount all those times in your life where you cowered it out, man, it's a horrifying thought.
Yeah, it is. And I think, having seen many patients towards the latter years of their life, even the latter moments of their life, and I've had the privilege of holding many a hand at the deathbed, and I can tell you, the biggest emotion, the biggest feeling is that of regret. It's things you didn't do. It's the chances you didn't take. It's the people you didn't ask. It's the promotions you didn't ask for. It's the job you didn't apply for. Regret. It's only an emotion realized right at the end.
I'm glad you brought this point up, Asu, because I've always gone by the phrase "death by 1,000 rejections." There's the old, the kung fu film "Death by 1,000 Cuts." Death by 1,000 rejections, almost like put yourself in a position where you're deliberately getting rejected.
Yeah.
So, in my 20s, I would apply for positions way above my pay grade. I would talk to people who were, classes way outside my initial network, just to get used to failure. And then eventually you become so impervious to it that, you use it as fuel.
Yeah.
What's the worst that can happen? They say no, okay. Move on to something other.
Yeah. And that's exactly what Gary Vee says as well in his talk. He says, what is the worst that can happen? Them saying no. But that is it. They won't prosecute you. They won't persecute you. They won't, ostracize or, castigate you. Literally, it's a no. It's just 2 letters. And secondly, this kind of inherent fear of rejection, shame, and failure is probably the biggest impediment to self-actualization.
Absolutely. I think one of the reasons for that is a lot of men, they attach their entire worth and identity with that failure.
Yeah.
So by the other person saying no or rejecting them, or for example, a woman says no to a date, for example, they view that as a direct critique of their worth.
Yeah.
And this is why they're so afraid to put themselves out there. You've got to create that distance. It's like, look, it's never personal. It's just business.
Yeah, absolutely. And having that and nurturing and cultivating that mindset where you emotionally detach yourself from the outcome of a decision and only invest in things you can actually control, which is your own self. Emotionally divest from these outcome of these decisions. There was actually a very good TED talk, which has got millions of views. It was about a guy in China, I believe, or Hong Kong, where he, for 100 days, he would go to random places. So he'd go to, for instance, a Starbucks and order a Pret coffee. He'd go to Burger King and order a McDonald's. So he'll do the opposite thing, where he knew he'll get rejected. So he'd actually go, to a beef place and order a chicken burger. So he did things which he would get rejected. It was comical, but he did it just to build thick skin. And after 100 days, he became absolutely impervious to any sort of rejection because he got it on a daily basis.
There you go.
That 100 days of rejection, so just over 3 months of persistent, daily, perennial rejection, prepared him for some of his greatest roles in life. I believe now he's either CEO, he's got his own business, and he said that he had to have that crash course in rejection because Asian culture, whether it's Chinese or South Asian culture, tremendously values, success. So you can't be rejected, you can't fail, and that's why we have to flip the script and actually be comfortable with discomfort.
No, absolutely. Just going back to the idea of culture, I think it's such an impediment, and then you add the pitfalls of being working class. It just amplifies all those all those effects. So yeah, I mean, look, for any men listening, like, put yourself out there. Like, I know it's difficult and it will take some time, but you've got to have those rejections. Yeah. Like, it will make you a better man.
Absolutely. And like one of my friends says, Brew, the singer Bruce C, fail your way forward. I never forget when he told me that. He said, fail your way forward. You don't know what you're good at, just keep doing it. It's refining. It's the whole part of, iterative process. You get better, you fail forward, it's trial and improvement. Amir, last minute, it's been great having you on the show. Some absolute gems and nuggets, some great insights, some sagacious pieces of information which, hopefully our viewers can take on board. I wish we had another half an hour, but any closing remarks?
I just want to say, there's a lot of information out there, just in terms of how to live your life and, what to do. And I think the problem with social media is a lot of men, they sort of live in this constant state of anxiety whereby, they watch the top 1% of men are living their lives, with fast cars and vacations and lots of women. And they become depressed about their own life, and then they curl up into a ball and not play the game. Use that as fuel. Use that for your